This sounds like a fascinating study and will have fascinating perspectives and insights, I think, on this area of internationalization. So, Metrice, over to you, please. You're muted at the moment, Metrice. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Let me just say thank you for it's so nice to be here. It's so nice hearing everyone's presentation, and I feel like there's a lot of overlap. Just a lot of really interesting good work that's out there. So I want to present MENSCH. Before I really dig deep into MENSCH, though, I want to give you a little bit of background. And so MENSCH is a framework that I developed to work with marginalized students. It was developed basically as a guide for educators to know their underrepresented students in a more holistic and real way. I should mention, because one of the things that sort of got things started was this idea, my area of expertise, I guess, is with study abroad. And it's this idea that I kept hearing that African-American students were not interested, African-American and Latino and other students of color were not interested in studying abroad. And that wasn't my experience. It wasn't the experience that I'd heard from other students that I'd interviewed later, and it wasn't the experience of friends that I had known either. So I thought, I think there's something here. So with that, next slide, please, Rebecca. Yep. Is the next slide there? Ah, there it is. Thank you. Oh, almost there. Just one more slide. There it is. Thanks. So to begin the background, I'm beginning it with this picture. This picture is a unique landmark in France, and it was one of my first aspirational dreams in Metrice. And how that got developed is another interesting story. I was enrolled in a French immersion program when I was a kid, because my mother was concerned about the public education that I was getting in our local school. And the mayor of the town encouraged her to enroll me into another public program that had French immersion as one of the pilot programs that they were doing. So everything was in French, and that was how I first got exposed to this landmark, which is called Mont Saint-Michel. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I learned through my own journey, because not only did I go to the French immersion school, but I also went on to study abroad. And where I finally got to see that landmark. It was wonderful. When I studied abroad, I went with $500 in my pocket. I barely knew that I was going to go, maybe 2 months before, maybe it was like a month before I actually left. And that $500 lasted the entire year that I was abroad. And I felt like I was, while I had a wonderful experience and I thrived, I felt like my experience was fairly unique, mine and another student who was of color. But because of that experience, I then knew that I could take on so many other things. And I decided that I wanted to go to grad school, and I trained as a therapist in clinical psychology. I lived abroad for over 25 years. I've lived abroad for over 25 years in both Germany and France. And because of those experiences, I've become passionate about education. When it came time to study at Lancaster and to do my thesis, and doing that extensive literature review, and looking for a theoretical framework that would match what my philosophies were in life, I decided to start digging. And so the first person is right here that I came across that really resonated for me was W.E.B. Du Bois. We've talked about him before in our, I think, the last seminar that we had. And I'll talk about him just briefly. Everyone that I talk about is going to be brief because there's not enough time to do them justice. I wish that there were, but they did have some influence in terms of how MENSCH became, just came to be, came into fruition. But one of the things that Du Bois is known for is this quote that you see here. But I can't read it all, but I'll read the part that really hit me between the eyes. And he describes, by the way, he describes this in 1903 in his book, The Souls of Black Folk. He says, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unrecorded strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. In his book from 1903, he describes something that I felt as a little girl, that I still feel today, that the people that are in my entourage that I encounter who are African-American or other, peoples of color, they describe this very same experience. And it's this idea of double consciousness. Except that for Du Bois, double consciousness wasn't necessarily something, a positive thing. It was something that you were supposed to shirk off, over time based on specific practices. And somehow that didn't really resonate with me. Something about that just did not feel right, at least to me in any case. For those of you who are interested, I would really recommend you to look at the last item that's in orange by Luna. It's an author who wrote a really brief article on what double consciousness meant to her as someone of Indian descent, because double consciousness is not just limited to one group. So I'm gonna, the next slide, sorry. Thank you. So I looked some more, and what I then encountered was Black feminism. And Black feminism really, really resonated to me, because one of the main tenets has to deal with this idea that no one is free until all of us are free. That certainly resonated. And I encountered bell hooks. Notice that bell hooks is actually written with a lower case B and H, and it's not a typo. So bell hooks really looks at the entirety of who we are, and doesn't see the entirety of our experiences, our identities, just our knowledge, skills, and abilities. All of that makes up who we are, and it doesn't mean that it's coming from a place of lack. And that really, really resonated for me. But it's still getting closer. And then I moved on to Kimberly Crenshaw, who is also a very wonderful, passionate person who coined the term intersectionality, which many of us use quite a bit. And what she said is Black women are sometimes excluded from feminist theory and an interracist policy discourse because both are predicated on a discrete set of experiences that often does not accurately reflect the interaction of race and gender. That's intersectionality, and that was really important because I remember when I was in primary school, my mother sat me down and she said, you're going to have to work harder. She told me I would have to work harder because, I was Black and I would also be a woman, and that it was important that I work 2 times as hard to get ahead in life. So again, that also resonated because, I know a lot of friends who've had that very same speech and can relate to that very well. The next slide, please. Okay. So the next influence had to do with critical race theory, and critical race theory right now is it's gotten dinged quite a bit, by our politicians, really, honestly. But critical race theory, to me, was a very powerful add-on, and also because of what happened with George Floyd. George Floyd inspired me to dig deeper and look more. And for those of you who don't know who George Floyd was, he was killed by an American police officer in the United States, and the whole world got to watch that image and got to see systemic racism playing out live. So critical race theory is sort of a way to address that. Just going back just slightly, critical race theory, Kimberly Crenshaw was also instrumental in the development of critical race theory, as were many other people, and it comes out of a legal tradition. But the one that I'm focusing on has to do with, it's a subgrouping, it has to do with education. And I hope I'm pronouncing their names right, Solorzano and Yoso are widely used when talking about education in CRT. What I focused on, though, I mean, all of these themes are really important, and you can look at those for yourself. But one that really resonated for me was this idea of the centrality of experiential knowledge, counter storytelling, and the idea that we really listen, to the people who are talking about their lived realities and their lived experiences. The next slide, please. And I'm sure someone will recognize the capability approach since we just heard from one of our colleagues. So thank you for that. Emeritus Sen and the capability approach and this idea of self-determination, that absolutely resonated. To me, it spoke to this idea of democracy and what democracy really means. The idea of real choice and agency to make our decisions and choices for ourselves, and the idea of community and community debate. So based on the capability approach, Metrice Sen really believed that it wasn't just the majority that rules, it's also the minority that gets to have a say and also gets to be heard. And I think that that's really important. The capability approach also works from a standpoint of realism. So, you're trying to work towards pushing the needle forward. You're not trying to build these utopian societies, so to speak, but you're working within the context of the organization or the systems that, that you're already in. So with that, I'm going to move to MENSCH, and that's in the next slide, please. Okay, so MENSCH is a way to get to know your students and understand directly from them how they see themselves, their lived realities, and evaluating how the systems in higher education will help or sometimes hinder them as they work towards their goals, while also valuing the student and not seeing them from a position of lack. I want to be clear, though, that MENSCH I used it for study abroad, but MENSCH it can be a flexible tool used and transferable in other areas and other domains. So MENSCH, let's talk about what it means. MENSCH is a German word that means human being. It means person of honor and integrity. So if we're already going into, spending time with our students or, other groups, and we're thinking the person across from us is a human being and they are a person of honor and integrity, to me, that starts the conversation on a positive foot. So MENSCH was chosen as an acronym to represent multiple consciousness. So breaking that down just a little bit. So how do the students that you encounter, how do they see themselves? We're not going to put those labels on them. We're going to let them tell us, what's important, for us to know about them. Exploring intersected identities. So how might their intersected identities impact their educational experience? That's important, looking at that. So in naming the power structures, who are the gatekeepers? And how are the power structures in education used to help or hinder? So, I'll just keep going in case we're short on time. So S for study abroad, but again, I used it for study abroad, but you could use it for other student programs. And what are some of the educational student contexts and the opportunities for counter storytelling, hearing about the student's perspective? And one of the, in my own research, one of the students that I discovered, she was talking about how, and she could barely make it to study abroad herself. And she did it at the cost of not being able to earn money, which she needed also for when she returned and for her housing. So when she returned home, and she lived out of her car because she didn't have the money that she needed. And what ended up happening is that a friend of hers, that friend's mother, actually intervened and opened her door so that the student could live with her in exchange for minor helps around the house. So that type of story, those type of contexts, if you're not hearing those stories, and sometimes it's a question of trust, then you don't know what the students are struggling with. And this was for a student that was able to go abroad. She did everything that she could to get abroad, but again, she did it at a sacrifice to herself. But there are other students that aren't able to because they have other conditions and other situations that are impacting them, that are keeping them as barriers that are keeping them from studying abroad. But if we as educators are not hearing,
1 minute left, Metrice. Yeah.
okay, I'm almost done. That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
If we as educators are not hearing those stories, then we're not understanding what the barriers are so that we can address them. So then the next part is C for the capability approach. Well, these are the relevant tools to increase access and participation or more inclusive practices from the community. And in the example I just gave, the mother opening her door, that was a community member saying, you know what, I have you. And then H is highlighting, really important one, is highlighting the knowledge, skills, and abilities. So we're so busy focusing on what students don't have, but we need to focus on what students do have and what they're bringing into the equation. So that means their strengths, and they're focusing on their strengths, and just, really focusing on what they're going to bring to the program and how they're going to be lending those skills and knowledges and abilities with their peers as well. So that completes my presentation, and thank you so much for hearing me out. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Metrice. Spot on time. So
great.
well done with that. And yes, and a very that was a really interesting presentation, and it was really nice to hear about your experiences and how and how you've moved through, and your thoughts about the processes of moving through as you've gone through your life. I think that's a really powerful story. So thank you for sharing that. That's very much appreciated, and also very helpful outcome in terms of the way that you're approaching things now and able to work with others on this. So well,
if I could just add one little thing, thank you so much for saying that. The reason why I focused on what my journey was a little bit was because my journey is amplified in other people's journey as well. And if I hadn't had that experience and those experiences, I know I wouldn't be here today. So that's why it was important. Thank you.
Thanks, Metrice. Thank you very much. So again, due to time, can I ask if there are any comments or questions that you address those via the chat, and then we'll be able to move on to the rest of the program due to the time. So I hope that's okay with you, Metrice. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.